Today I'm going to be talking to you about refracting the slave narrative. So hopefully through this presentation I'm going to give you a snapshot of my dissertation research, which looked at a small sample collection of audio recorded slave narratives. So a little bit of background to set the scene. The Depression era was 1929 to 1939 in America, and this is where the sample was collected from. The period was characterized by high unemployment, racially ostracized society, and generally quite impoverished and oppressive conditions. Yet, out of this period came a complex effort to seek and define America as a culture. There was a nationalistic movement, which is where this kind of social project came from. So, the WPA slave narratives. As part of a social project, the Works Progress Administration was created by Roosevelt under his New Deal program. It aimed to find employment for out-of-work scholars going around socially. So these narratives allowed a group of poor and despised people, the marginalized African Americans in the southern states, an opportunity to give their side of the picture, which was very rare at the time period. These WPA slave narratives, most of them, there was 3,000 in total, around 3,000, most of them were transcribed. They became one of the most widely used evidentiary streams, but also among the more contested due to issues with authorship, authenticity, and memory. So generally, recently, there's been a reinterpretation of American history, trying to find a new method and new analysis for looking at African American sources. And one of these ways is oral history. As Escott said, it's an embarrassing fact that until recently historians have studied slavery almost entirely from white sources. So this is where my research project comes in. I've tried to look at a small collection of audio recordings and by giving agency to the voices of these slaves, by listening to them kind of move with this kind of collective movement. So my research questions were, what could we discover from listening to these audio recordings, especially compared to the transcriptions? How did the social and racial context influence the creation of these narratives? To what extent did the Lomaxes, John and Alan Lomax, formed my sample? How did their personal views as white Southerners influence the interviews and affect the dynamic within the interviews? And what limitations are their traditional methods of analysis using transcripts? Ultimately, I wanted to try and show why historians should listen to the voice of former slaves and show a kind of new contemporary method of doing this. So, my research methods. First, I had to consider traditional historiography and methods around slave narratives, so secondary sources. What I found was that most secondary sources used transcriptions, and there wasn't so much interest in how these slaves, former slaves, spoke, and as a result, what that meant for the evidence. This meant that I listened to a lot of slave narratives as part of the collection, Voices Remembering Slavery. This is where my sample was formed from. It's part of the Library of Congress, and there's about 30 audio recordings there that survive. Obviously, most of the slave narratives are transcribed. I found my sample. My sample was 10 interviews with 5 interviewees, all collected between 1935 and 40 by the Lomaxes across southern states of America. I researched also, I had to consider the racial, social, and contextual background of America at the time and consider how this affected what the former slaves said. This also meant that using oral history theory, I examined how we conceive memory, identity, and performance in the audio recordings and how this then impacted our understanding of these themes. My basic premise was that what one hears and what one reads offers two distinctly different experiences, and this was an important part of historical methodology. So, Uncle Billy McRae, I'm going to give you an example through my examples of evidence with one interviewee, Uncle Billy McRae. He was born in 1851, which made him 89 at the time of the recording. The recording took place in 1940, which meant he was 14 or 15 at the time of emancipation. John Lomax and Uncle Billy spent 3 days together recording, chatting, and reminiscing about the old days. Interestingly, Uncle Billy McRae records his experience with Uncle Billy McRae in his autobiography, citing him as a noteworthy individual he met. So I looked at the interviewer. I tried to understand how the oral interview should be seen as a multi-layered communicative event. By listening to this, I was able to understand how all the background noises, interruptions, fluency were affected by the social and racial dynamics at the time. So the social context, as I already discussed, was important in terms of racism set the bounds for their dealings with blacks. Having a white interviewer and a black interviewee obviously had its limitations. The personal agendas of John and Alan Lomax. So the Lomaxes acknowledged that personal beliefs motivated their work and that their agenda shaped their collecting and their scholarship. So this idea is really important because they were white Southerners, and although they were actively giving agency to the voices of former slaves, they also had these kind of racial prejudices that were kind of inherent. And the process of interviewing, so how the equipment, how the process affected the fluency and narrative. So as we can see here, he was a bit timid of the microphone, and the equipment quite intimidating the formal atmosphere. So I'm going to show you a few, you can listen to a few audio recordings. The first, I've put the transcripts up just so you can understand. The first is addressing racial etiquette. Throughout the audio recordings with Uncle Billy McRae, John Lomax refers to him as uncle, whereas Uncle Billy McRae refers to John as sir, and Ruby as ma'am. And the second one, just to show how this was ingrained in the psyche of the former slaves, he refers to himself as a big boy then. Also, I wanted to just show how the uncomfortable dynamic also affected the fluency and obviously what was said within the interviews. You can see the transcripts that this dynamic within the interview is very important within my research to understand the kind of context around why the former slaves spoke, how they did, what they said, and how they said it. So the next, I looked at performance. An oral history is first and foremost a performance of words. I wanted this to be kind of important because, you know, a lot of the medium in which these former slaves spoke was through stories, songs, and this was really important. So songs, storytelling, as we can see here, blacks knew how to amuse whites, for storytelling was a basic survival tactic. Within the context of the interview, you can see how this was then come across in the interview. And orality. Studying the spoken word, how its traits, idiosyncrasies, and nuances, and how this can help these former slaves, Uncle Billy McRae especially. He takes a lot of pride in how he performs through songs, through stories, and that's an important factor. Uncle Billy McRae is kind of self-critical, and this is an important part because obviously he takes a lot of pride in his performances. Storytelling, as well as we spoke, was a survival tactic in which they were able to express themselves through this medium. So, as we can see here, he tells the story, his monologue is 7 minutes, and he then quite poignantly states that I've been through a heap and laughs it off, and this is a sort of way of kind of coping. And also, an interesting point of comparison is the songs and the fluency that's then available. I'm going to get pushed off the stage in a minute. So conclusions. So I hope Uncle Billy, although you couldn't hear the audio recordings, offers an insight into what I was trying to do, the complex nature of the interview, how he perceives himself and how he expresses himself within the interview through song and storytelling, I just wanted to kind of, there were limitations with my sample size, of course, and the majority of slave narratives are in transcripted form, but by listening to audio recordings, hopefully you can see that there's a lot more to what's evidence-based by changing the methodology in which we study these kind of historical sources, and by giving agency to the voice of these former slaves. That's kind of what I've tried to do. So yeah, thank you.
What reason or information did the Lomaxes give to their subjects regarding the purpose of recordings?
So the trouble with some of the audio recordings is that a lot of the context around, for example, why they started, why they stopped, is difficult to get. There was part of the WPA slave narratives, there was a questionnaire essentially that was sent out, who John Lomax constructed this questionnaire, which was essentially to, the idea was that there was going to be, it was almost like a stream of consciousness where the former slaves spoke, and the interviewer's role was therefore to kind of prompt them and help them by asking questions and probing into these issues. So, I mean, what's interesting is the correlation between what I found within my research between how many times the interviewer asked and the overall fluency of the kind of the dynamic within the narratives. I hope that kind of answers your question.
I have a follow-up question. Related to the question just being answered, are there any recognised ethical issues around using this data?
Are there any? I think what was important was that obviously, I'm looking at this from obviously, in hindsight, 70, 80 years past, and I think what was important was that I needed to kind of infer and not, over-exert my opinions within this, because, giving agency, the whole idea was, through this method, I was able to give agency to the voice of these former slaves and let them express. And that was the fundamental point in which my analysis kind of took, was letting the voice of these former slaves present themselves as the evidence and then work off that. And obviously within the context of, okay, the interviewer, the racial dynamic, and try and do that. So yeah, I think, there are ethical issues. I didn't want to kind of be brutish with my views and opinions, but I think letting these this evidence base speak for itself is what fundamentally my kind of project was looking to do.
Just to follow on from what you just said, I was interested to know what brought you to this project, and actually, because if you think about why you're doing it, it could help you to think about how you influence the interpretation that you're giving us. So what kind of brought you to study this?
Well, I mean, in junior honours, I'd looked at America, and I was kind of faced with the task of finding a dissertation project, and originally I was going to look at kind of a completely different area, but I kind of looked, and I'd studied this kind of slave narrative collections before, and knew that most of the historiography and most of the literature around them had been on those sources as transcripts. And when I found out that it was audio recordings, I then researched, okay, well, what's been done on these audio recordings, and generally what's been done with audio recordings, what one can hear and what one can read, and the experiences that causes as an evidence base is very different. And I found that there was not a lot that's been done at all within history, especially. So let alone these kind of slave narratives, and it was really, really interesting within the context in which they were kind of produced, and also generally now with Atlantic history and this kind of viewpoint of, okay, well, generally there's been a traditional kind of historiography here where most of the writers have been white, middle class, educated men, and these sources, they have kind of then made them kind of conform to these views. So by expressing this kind of, the importance of listening to these sources in a different way, I've kind of hoped to show a different evidence base and work from there. So I mean, my point has been not to kind of critique other I mean, as you can see, it's quite difficult to understand a lot of them. But what I want to kind of offer is that this is kind of an interdisciplinary, you know, there's areas of anthropology, kind of psychology within this as well. But, you know, it supplements the evidence base and what we can take then and learn and add on to the transcripts. So that was what I kind of wanted to do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers.